Do you have any comprehension of the suffering that you've brought the families of the people that you've killed?
I don't have any remorse, for some reason.
One man sang hymns while the poison entered his veins. One asked which state executed the most killers, then drove straight there. One ordered KFC for his last meal because he used to manage 3 of them. And one died because a nurse refused to authorize a wheelchair. 5 killers. 5 final days. Here's what actually happened. Before we start, if you're new here, hit like and subscribe. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I put these videos out for free, and honestly, I just want to know how far this thing travels. Number 1. Ted Bundy. In December 1977, a prisoner in Colorado asked a local cop a simple question. Which state executes the most killers? The answer was Florida. Days later, he escaped and drove straight there. His name was Ted Bundy. January 23rd, 1989. Bundy sat across from Dr. James Dobson for his final on-camera interview. Midway through, the lights flickered. Engineers next door were testing the electric chair for the following morning. Bundy smiled. Just wait a moment. They'll come back on. He spent the rest of the interview blaming pornography for everything he'd done. By evening, every appeal had failed.
And it happened in stages, gradually. It doesn't necessarily, not to me at least, happen overnight. My experience with, I say pornography generally, but with pornography that deals on a violent level with the sexuality, is that once you become addicted to it, and I look at this as a kind of addiction, like other kinds of addiction, I would keep looking for more potent, more explicit, more graphic kinds of material.
Bundy called FBI agent Bill Hagmaier, the one man he actually trusted. For the first time, the walls came down. He admitted to 30 murders, confessed to sawing off the heads of 12 victims and keeping them in his Seattle apartment. He fed investigators details about missing remains, hoping to buy one more sunrise. The governor of Florida didn't blink. Midnight. A tray of steak and eggs sat untouched on the floor. He called his mother twice. Carol Ann Boone, the woman who married him in open court, had already changed her name and made clear she would never pick up again. Head shaved, one leg shaved clean for the electrode. Bundy wept and prayed with Chaplain Fred Lawrence. The man who controlled everything had no one left to call back. 7 o'clock sharp. Bundy was walked into the execution chamber and lowered into Old Sparky, a 64-year-old oak chair built by inmates. Straps locked across his chest, wrists, and ankles. He turned toward his attorney and chaplain, voice breaking. "I'd like you to give my love to my family and friends." A black leather mask came down. 707. An anonymous executioner, paid $150, closed the switch. 2,000 volts. 7:16, his heart stopped. Ted Bundy was dead at 42. His ashes were scattered over the Cascade Mountains in Washington, the same place where it all started. Number 2. Arthur Shawcross. He killed 11 women, left their bodies scattered along the banks of the Genesee River in upstate New York. Got a sentence so long, 250 years, that the number itself felt like a joke. But the thing that finally killed Arthur Shawcross wasn't a needle, wasn't a judge, wasn't justice. It was a wheelchair, one that nobody would push. Here's what most people don't know. New York abolished the death penalty in 2004. By 2008, the execution chamber at Green Haven Correctional Facility had already been dismantled. The lethal injection table, gone. Arthur Shawcross was never going to die on death row. He was going to die behind a wall of paperwork and indifference. November 7th, 2008. Sullivan Correctional Facility. Shawcross was 63 years old, obese, severely diabetic, dependent on daily insulin just to function. That evening, he told the guard on duty that his leg was in agony. He couldn't walk, not to the medical station, not anywhere. The guard requested a wheelchair. The nurse on duty refused. No wheelchair authorization on file. No paperwork. No chair. Simple as that. Now, why didn't anyone push harder? Because Arthur Shawcross had spent his entire life lying. He told courts his mother sexually abused him. No records, no corroboration. He told interviewers he was a decorated sniper in Vietnam, that he'd beheaded enemies, eaten human flesh in the jungle. His actual military file said he worked in a supply warehouse and never saw combat. A man who had cried wolf 1,000 times. So when the wolf actually came, nobody moved. That night, 2 fellow inmates had to drag him down the hallway. Inside his pelvic vein, a blood clot was growing. Quietly. Untreated. While the whole incident got logged in a security journal and nothing else happened. November 10th. 3 days later, the pain had become unbearable. Medical staff finally decided to transfer him to Albany Medical Center. But Sullivan had no wheelchair-accessible transport vehicle on site. They had to wait. Nearly 4 hours. For a van to be dispatched from another facility. 4 hours. The clot didn't wait. Somewhere on the road to Albany, or in the moments after arrival, it broke free. Traveled through the inferior vena cava, straight into the pulmonary artery. Massive pulmonary embolism. Cardiac arrest. Instantaneous and total. The doctors worked frantically to revive him. It wasn't enough. 9:50 p.m., November 10th, 2008. Arthur John Shawcross was pronounced dead. His last letter wasn't addressed to a lawyer, not a journalist, not family. It went to Tony Ciaglia, a stranger with a traumatic brain injury who collected letters from serial killers. In it, Shawcross made one final request. He wanted Tony to hold on to his ashes. Number 3. Danny Rolling. On October 25th, 2006, inside Florida State Prison, Danny Rolling was strapped to a gurney with 2 IVs in his arms. He didn't cry. He didn't beg. He sang a hymn he wrote himself. That's Danny Rolling, the Gainesville Ripper. 5 students. 4 days. A Florida college town that never truly slept again. This is his final 24 hours. October 24th. Q-Wing Isolation Block. Pastor Mike Hudspeth steps into Rolling's cell for what looks like a routine pastoral visit. 2 hours later, he walks out carrying something no investigator had managed to extract in nearly 2 decades. A confession. Rolling had just admitted to the 1989 massacre of the Grissom family in Shreveport, Louisiana. A father, his daughter, and her 8-year-old son. 3 lives, held secret for 17 years, released with less than 24 hours left to breathe. Don't call it repentance. Forensic psychologists would call it a power move. By hoarding that secret until the final hours, Rolling sent one unmistakable message. The truth belonged to him. Not the FBI, not the forensic labs. Him. His confirmed body count had just risen to 8, morning of October 25th. Rolling is calm, disturbingly calm. He spends the morning with his brother Kevin and Pastor Hudspeth. Then comes the last meal. Lobster tail, butterfly shrimp, baked potato, strawberry cheesecake, sweet tea. A full restaurant order, delivered to a death row cell. When the plates were cleared, Rolling quietly picked up a pen. Not to write apologies to the families waiting behind that glass. Instead, he produced a 1-page written confession, every paragraph opening with an oversized Gothic letter, hand-drawn with the precision of someone composing a manuscript. He wrote, "This hand extinguished those precious lights from this dark world." He wasn't confessing. He was curating his own image, designing the opening page of his own dark, archived legacy. 6 o'clock. The curtain lifts. 47 witnesses stand behind the glass. Among them, parents who buried their children 16 years ago, still waiting for one word of remorse. Rolling didn't give them one. He sang a slow, self-written hymn. 2 full minutes. Deep, deliberate, and completely unashamed. None greater than Thee, O Lord. The families were furious. The warden cut the microphone. But through the glass, even after the room went silent, Rolling kept going, lips moving. No sound, as the chemicals entered his veins. At 6:13 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, Daniel Harold Rolling was pronounced dead. He was just 52 years old. Even with poison in his blood, he refused to leave the stage. That was exactly the death he had always wanted. But it was never, not even close, the death he deserved. Number 4. Aileen Wuornos. On the morning of October 9th, 2002, Aileen Wuornos turned down her last meal. Under $20. Anything she wanted. She said no. Her only request, black coffee. Not because she wasn't hungry, because she believed the guards would poison her food. That was the mind strapped to a gurney in Starka, Florida. The 10th woman executed in America since 1976. She had fired her own lawyers, dropped every appeal. She volunteered to die. But in those final 24 hours, her mind was already somewhere else. The afternoon before, filmmaker Nick Broomfield sat across from her with a camera. What he recorded was disturbing. Wuornos claimed prison staff were using sonic pressure, actual sound waves, to manipulate her brain, to make her appear insane on camera. She accused the police of letting her keep killing, deliberately, so they could profit from book deals and movie contracts. Her eyes would flare with rage, then go hollow. Rage. Then nothing. A mind tearing itself apart. And suddenly, the coffee made sense. She wouldn't touch anything she couldn't see through. A dark liquid in a white cup. The only thing in that prison she trusted. Everything else felt like a trap. And yet, hours later, she smiled. At 9 p.m., her oldest friend walked in. Dawn Botkins, all the way from Michigan. 3 hours. No tears. No breaking down. Wuornos said she was happy, ready to leave this world. She prayed for the families of the 7 men she had killed. At midnight, Botkins made one promise. She would bring the ashes home. The door closed. Wuornos spent the rest of the night alone with a Bible and a crackling radio. When the sun came up, there was no one left. At 9:29 a.m., the brown curtain was pulled back. She was strapped into a blue surgical gurney, leather restraints across her chest. Her eyes swept the room, scanning every face. Then they stopped. She stared straight up at the ceiling. Prosecutor John Tanner was watching. So was Terry Griffith, the daughter of Dick Humphreys, the 6th man Wuornos had shot dead. When asked for her final statement, she said, "I'd just like to say I'm sailing with the Rock, and I'll be back like Independence Day with Jesus June 6th. Like the movie, big mothership and all. I'll be back." Religious faith, Independence Day, a spaceship, fused together in one sentence by a mind that had already left the room. Potassium chloride entered her veins. Her chest rose, then fell. Her skin turned gray. 9:47 a.m., Aileen Wuornos was pronounced dead. A few days later, her ashes were scattered beneath a tree in Michigan. Natalie Merchant's Carnival played in the wind. Number 5. John Wayne Gacy. Outside the walls of Stateville Correctional Center, 5,000 people had gathered. Not in silence, not in mourning. They had balloons, party hats. Someone was setting off fireworks. Inside that same crowd, Sue Morris stood still with her 16-year-old daughter. No cheering, just waiting, the way families always do. Quietly, at 6:55 that evening, the United States Supreme Court rejected the final appeal. Every legal door had closed. John Wayne Gacy, the killer clown who buried 33 bodies beneath the floorboards of his suburban Chicago home, had hours left. Back in his cell, Gacy wasn't panicking. Prison officials described him as talkative, chatty even. He called himself the 34th victim of a biased justice system, of a media that needed a monster. Then came his final meal request: 12 butterfly shrimp, a bucket of KFC original recipe, French fries, fresh strawberries, a Diet Coke. Why KFC? Before the murders, before the clown suit, before the bodies. John Wayne Gacy managed 3 KFC restaurants in Waterloo, Iowa. He insisted his employees call him Colonel. He brought fried chicken to JC's meetings. He wanted to be seen as a respectable man. Those same restaurants were where he preyed on young male employees. The last meal wasn't a food preference. It was a mask. He was putting it back on one final time. At 12:01 a.m. on May 10, 1994, Gacy was strapped onto a crucifix-shaped gurney. He was asked if he had any last words. No apology. No acknowledgement of 33 families. He looked directly at the execution team and said, "Kiss my ass." The first drug entered his bloodstream. Gacy lost consciousness. Then the second drug was pushed through. Inside the IV tube, the two chemicals met and solidified. A white precipitate formed. The line was blocked. Beneath the sheet, Gacy began to snore, then gasp, then twitch. Officials ordered the observation curtain pulled shut. Behind that curtain, for 10 minutes, the execution team struggled. No medical training, no protocol for what had just happened. They had forgotten to flush the line with saline, a procedure they had never been taught. They replaced the tubing. The curtain opened again. At 12:58 a.m., John Wayne Gacy was pronounced dead. 18 minutes, not the 5 that were planned. At 3 a.m., forensic psychiatrist Dr. Helen Morrison removed Gacy's brain. She placed it in a glass jar and drove home herself, in the passenger seat of her Buick. 14 years of interviews, trying to find the biological flaw that explained everything. The analysis came back in one line. Normal brain, no tumor, no damage, no structural defect. Just a man who chose to do what he did and took the reason to his grave. 5 different killers, 5 different deaths. But the same thing shows up every time. The system built to handle these men was never fully ready for them. A botched execution because nobody flushed a tube. A serial killer who died waiting for a wheelchair. A brain that came back completely normal on the scan. No biological defect. No clear explanation. Just people who made choices. And a system that kept improvising around them until the very end. If you want us to keep researching stories like this, please consider subscribing. We're trying to reach our first 1,000 subscribers, and every early subscriber truly means a lot. It gives us the motivation to keep making deeper, better, true crime videos for you.